who is a new bestseller in America, and apparently it's been a bestseller in Australia for some time. When did your book publish in Australia?
Thank you for having me. The book came out in Australia on the 24th of May, so it's been a few months out over there now.
How exciting.
Yeah.
She shares the publisher with Michael Conley and with Carrie Greenwood. We published the Miss Fisher mysteries, you know, here, but Alan Unwin's a very distinguished publisher. Actually, they've taken on Manette Walters for an historical.
Yes, they have. Yes, I've been seeing them, been promoting that all over their social media platforms. So yeah, they've been amazing for me. So it's been a really lovely experience.
I was telling Sarah that I've made a couple of trips to Australia, and I have a nephew now who lives there with his family. And I recall on my first trip that the crime fiction for sale in most bookshops was mostly American. It was almost all hard-boiled American, and it was incredibly expensive. The price of books, the paperback books, was in Australian dollars back then. It was a while ago. It was really high.
I think it's changed a little bit
Yep.
in the last couple of years. So I think particularly crime has, I think it's exploded everywhere, but I think in Australia particularly there's a lot more Australian voices now in our country than there used to be. And now that the Scandinavian trend is somewhat dissipated, I think we've now got what we're calling the gumleaf detectives, which is the Australian version of that. There's quite a lot of names. I've heard all kinds of weird names, but I think we're trying to find the one that makes the most sense. But yeah, there's definitely been a lot more local crime authors popping up in Australia. And then also, I think we've really embraced kind of all kinds of crime from all over the world as well. So it's pretty diverse at the moment, which is fun.
I think it is too. Also, Australia, lots of books have what are called British and Commonwealth rights, which means that the British publisher in London also is the publisher for South Africa, Australia, sometimes Canada, although that can be North American and all. And so I do know that it used to be that books were printed in England and shipped to Australia, which probably accounted for the extreme cost. And now I think that publishing in Australia is printing books in Australia, and there are more Australian publishers, and so that would have a favorable impact, at least on the pricing.
I think that's right. There's quite a lot of new publishers that have popped up in Australia over the last decade, and also the book market in Australia is a lot healthier than it was too. So, I mean, we're only quite small, I think 24, 25 million people in total, but the book publishing industry is actually quite robust over there at the moment, which obviously helps. So there's lots of new titles being published locally.
It does indeed. So what has inspired you to write The Dark Lake, which is a police procedural, but so much more?
Yeah, so I didn't set out to write crime actually at all. And then a few people that were reading drafts sort of said to me, "Do you realise that someone dies at the start of the book, so it is crime?" And I sort of thought, I guess it is. But it wasn't like I sort of sat down and set to write a crime book. I actually was about halfway through another book that I was really passionate about, that I thought was amazing, and then I just got really, really stuck and I couldn't finish it. So I was sort of in the stages of being quite frustrated about that, and on a little bit of a break trying to figure out that book and how it might work. And then this idea kind of came along, and it started really just with an idea about a character, the lake. I had this kind of concept of a detective who had quite a few personal challenges going on, who was investigating a crime of someone that she went to high school with years ago, and I just thought that would be quite an interesting premise. And then from there it sort of just started building into more and more of a plot and more of an idea. But because I had been so frustrated about not being able to finish the other book, I kind of kept trying to not be distracted by this idea, because I've read all of the blogs where people say, you've got to focus, you can't get distracted by the new ideas, otherwise you'll never finish anything, which I thought was probably pretty good advice. So I kept sort of writing little bits of this idea down, and then kind of going, I'll come back to that, and I'll finish that when I get this other one done. And then it just got to a tipping point really where I was so much more into this idea and so much more invested in this plot and this character and this concept that I sort of had written more of this than the other one. before I knew it, and then I just thought, well, I may as well finish this one now because it's closer to being finished than the other one is. So yeah, it sort of was wasn't by accident. I was really keen, obviously, to write something, but I sort of I guess I went about it by writing 1.5 books.
Why not? And I'm sure nothing's ever wasted for a writer, so now you'll be able to do something. So in order to introduce us to your character, your voice, would you like to read a paragraph or so?
Sure.
I think that if you hear her voice, that it'll be more exciting for you when you read the book.
Sure. So I'll actually read right from the start of the book, which is from the prologue, which is titled Now. When I think back to that summer, something comes loose in my head. It's like a marble is bouncing around in there, like my brain is a pinball machine. I try not to let it roll around for too long. If I do, I end up going funny behind the eyes and in my throat, and I can't do normal things like order coffee or tie Ben's shoelaces. I know I should try to forget. Move on. It's what I would tell someone else in my situation to do. Probably I should move away, leave Smithson, but starting over has never been a strength of mine. I have trouble letting go. During the day it's not so bad. I'll be in the middle of doing something and then my mind wanders to her and the little ball ricochets through my head and I stop talking in the middle of a sentence. Or I forget to press the accelerator when the lights go green. Still, I can usually shake it away and keep going with whatever I was doing without anyone noticing. It's amazing what you can keep buried when you want to. But sometimes late at night, I let myself think about what happened. Really think. I remember the throbbing heat. I remember the madness in my head and the fear that pulsed in my chest. And I remember Rosalind, of course, always Rosalind. I lie flat on my back as she appears on my bedroom ceiling, playing across it like a lightless slideshow. I click through the images. Her in grade 1 with her socks pulled up high, her walking down Ayres Road towards the bus stop, backpack bobbing, her smoking a cigarette on the edges of the school oval, her drunk at Kathy Roper's party, eyes heavy with dark liner, her at our debutante ball, dressed in white, her kissing him, her lying on the autopsy table with her body splayed open.
Well, so look at all the things that you learn in that one paragraph. First of all, Smithson. Tell us about Smithson.
So Smithson is a very generic, as the name would suggest, country town in regional New South Wales in Australia. It's inner country, so it's nowhere near the beach. It's very hot, it's very dry, it's very isolated. It was a town that was quite small, and then at the time that the book starts, it's sort of seen this influx of activity and business because a big cannery's been built there about 10 years before, so it's attracted lots of new people to the area, lots of new jobs. So my character, who grew up there, has kind of seen it transition from quite small regional farming town into this still small, still sort of 25,000 odd people, but starting to have all of the growing pains that a town experiences when it sort of adds a third of its population onto it. So there's lots of new faces in the town, as well as all of the old faces that she's grown up with.
I was thinking about South Dakota when I was reading it, kind of similar geography and what happened in South Dakota when the fracking got going, and all of a sudden, C.J. Box has written about that, the enormous influx of population and money and the crime that goes with, people not necessarily with families, but on the loose, and it's a whole different, yeah, it is. So there was a mention of tying Ben's shoelaces, so who do we already suspect that there must be either a disabled adult or a child in the picture, right?
Yeah, so Ben is Gemma's son. He's about 2.5 in this book, and Ben represents everything about Gemma's sort of torn world, I guess. So because she has Ben, she's quite stuck in Smithson. So a lot of the book, not that it's overtly about this, but the themes of her roles, her various roles, and all of the different hats she wears really comes through, I think. So she's a mother, she's a detective, she's a partner, she's a lover, she's a daughter. So I think a lot of the motherhood role questions that she has definitely kind of come to light in the decisions that she makes.
Just last night, I read a book set in England right after World War I, in which the crux of the plot has to do with a woman who's pregnant by somebody she's not married to, and how totally tragic this is, and it leads to things. So, but we have Gemma who has a partner, and I'm not clear anymore. Partner used to mean to me different things, but now it seems to me that couples of both sexes have partners as opposed to couples of one sex having partners. So she has Ben's father is somebody she's not married to, and that's part of what's going on. But that seems to be okay with everybody, which is, a very 21st century sort of thing for a small town.
I think it's probably not so much okay for him. I think he really wants to be married to her, which kind of comes up in the book a bit. But she is, she's just someone who's constantly fighting anything that's going to lock her in. So she is personally quite happy not being married to him. But obviously she's torn because they have had a son together. So that has bound them together, now, forever, really.
Well, it does bind them together, and also since she's a detective, it's difficult to be a working policewoman if you have a baby without someone to look after it. You can't just take it to the office or out on investigations and so forth. So somebody like Ben or somebody like her mother or something is essential, I think, for a woman with a small child. But she also has a lover. Which is even more complicated.
It's very complicated.
And, that's a lot. I think that's a lot of the tension in the book, is following Gemma's relationship with Finn, who is not only her lover, but her partner in another partner, and the police force.
Yeah, that's right. I think the book's definitely got the criminal aspect and that layer to it, but a lot of it is also a big character study on Gemma and what she is going to do and what decisions she's going to make, because when even right at the start of the book, it's pretty clear something has to give at some point. She can't coexist in the world with her son, her de facto partner, and her detective partner. Something is going to implode at some point. So yeah, that's kind of there's quite a lot at stake.
There are other, if you've read Farrell Coleman's most recent Jesse Stone, it's all about his battle with alcohol. So there is always some challenge, I guess, for an interesting character in personal life or habits, that in addition to the actual investigation.
That's right. Yep.
Very interesting. So Smithson is there's a lake, and that seems to be a salient feature of the landscape.
Yeah. The lake is I think it's very much the centre of the town. I think that often happens anywhere where there's water, and it is also representative, I think, of their high school years. And because the murder victim, is someone that Gemma went to school with, a lot of the book is bringing up the past for her. So there's a flashback treatment throughout the book where, the reader scooped back and forth from the present to a decade previously. And the lake was very central then for a whole lot of reasons. Lots of the action back then happened at the lake, and then similarly it's also the scene of the crime, so it's very much it's very central to the whole sort of story. And then I think, metaphorically as well, it pulls her in, and it's a place that she has avoided going for so long because it's represented bad memories, and then she's forced back to there. So she's sort of forced back to face all of these things in the past that she never really confronted properly.
High school is never passed. Those of you who read Sean Sanford's new book, Deep Freeze, is exactly the same. High school haunts you. Yes, I know. I mean, it really. So the quite early in the book, we actually get a vision of the victim, or you show us the victim. How is she found? Because it's really quite an elaborate crime scene.
Yeah. So the victim is discovered in the lake. So straight away, you kind of, as a reader, know that the person who's narrating you through this story is possibly not to be 100% trusted.
Right, which is interesting. So you look at the woman and you can't decide, is this really sort of like Ophelia and Hamlet, or is this really Edward Burne-Jones? It actually wasn't Burne-Jones. It was, I can't remember, that whole William Morris group in the Cotswolds in Oxford at the end of the 19th century, and one of them, Lizzie, wasn't it Lizzie? I can't think of her name. Anyway, the model for one of them was found floating in the river, with flowers in her hair and so forth. and there she was buried with the poems belonging to one of them, and later he dug her up to get his poetry back. So it's the whole William Morris School. It's really an interesting, seriously, you might want to look it up sometime. Lizzie Siddall, I think her name is, Siddal. But that's who I thought of when, you know, when I read about your woman floating with her long blonde hair and the roses and all, I thought, oh, this Lizzie. But we have certainly images from Hamlet and possibly from Arthur, King Arthur, and all that, of women found floating in water and dead, right?
That's right. Yeah, the book does have a fairly overt Shakespearean reference throughout. The school play is the night before the body's found, and Rosalind, the murder victim, is a teacher at the high school where she was a student also, and she has reimagined Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet play. So there is sort of a big theme throughout that of Romeo and Juliet, and it's also something that they studied when they were at school together. And Gemma really liked literature and liked that. So yeah, it's a theme that is definitely woven throughout the whole book.
Well, no, it's definitely Shakespeare, but in Romeo and Juliet did not die in water.
No.
So totally different thing.
Just borrowed some of those sort of iconography from different Shakespearean stories. Yeah.
So one of the interesting things I think is to, you know, an adult Gemma has to look back at a younger Gemma and what she did or did not know and what she thought was true and was not true about other people in her lives. And high school is that really transformative time, you know, is when we go from being, I think personally junior high school is like the pits. I don't know about the rest of you, but I hated junior high school. High school is that sort of transition where some people are really mature and other people are still kids, and you know, you don't know what's going on with their home lives. And maybe high school is still the place where shame has a bigger punch than, because we've kind of gotten away, well, we all know that from our current political situation, that shame doesn't seem to have the resonance that it once did. But I think in high school, children are you know, kids really want to like save face or be Chinese, but shame is a very powerful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Gemma's spent a lot of time, even though she has stayed in the town and she hasn't moved on, I guess, she hasn't also spent a whole lot of time looking backwards, and then this incident really forces her to reflect on that time of her life and think about, like you said, things that she did or didn't do, and then she is also thrust back into these environments that she hasn't been to for years, like going back to the old high school and then seeing some people that were part of her world from back then. So yeah, it's quite a confronting process, but obviously through that process she grows in some ways and learns things and reflects about herself. So it's an important process as well.
Do you see this as the start of a series, or do you see this as like the story of Gemma and then that's it?
It's definitely the start of at least a 2-part series. So, the second book is almost finished at the moment. So yeah, she has a whole nother story. And it's set about 3 years after this book finishes. So yeah, she's moved on a little bit, but she's definitely still Gemma. She's still difficult and a little bit frustrating at times, but yeah, she's definitely moved into a different phase in her life in the second book.
Why do you think that this book has had such a resonance in America, where it's done extremely well? What is it you think that, you know, because not all books set in other countries and cultures translate all that well to a different one. And I'm not talking about the language, I'm talking about the rest of it.
I don't know. I mean, I was obviously just so thrilled that an American publisher was keen to print it here and to have it available here, and then now that it's out here and people are reading it, it's really nice. And I think it's probably to do with the character more so than the setting. I don't think that it's because it's set in Australia that people here are interested in reading it particularly. I think it's always going to be about character and story, really. And I think that Gemma is, I think she's pretty polarizing. Like I definitely get quite strong opinions. Andy and I were talking about that before. I get quite strong opinions from both sides, but I think for the most part, people find her interesting and find her decision making interesting and like the complexity of her and the layers that she has, and can empathise with her thinking, even if they don't agree with the decisions that she ends up making.
So we can actually ask her publisher, Andy, why do you think you're her publicist and you're here from New York, or actually California, but you work for her publisher?
I think we've talked about this a lot tonight. I just think that readers are looking for characters that challenge norms, you know, that make people think differently and sort of subvert expectations. And Gemma's a really terrific character, and I think that she just really pulls people in, and it's not exactly what you'd expect from the beginning, and I think that that's a really, it's a nice shift, it's a nice change of pace, especially for crime fiction.
Good response. All right. None of you have had time to read it yet, right? So, all right. Do any of you have questions that we can't really say much more about this book, or we're going to totally ruin the read for you, but do any of you have questions that you would like to ask, Sarah?
Just, I got through the prologue and the first few chapters while I was waiting here.
Thank you.
And I will probably finish it tonight, so it's your fault if I'm tired in the morning.
You guys all read so fast around here.
But the prologue, which you read, was just amazing.
Thank
I
you.
got grabbed and hauled
you.
into it.
Yeah,
Part of the reason probably is too that she just drops little breadcrumbs in it, and then you have to, you know, she doesn't say, you know, tie the shoes of my 2.5-year-old son Ben. It's just like, Ben, who's Ben?
That is.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
I think that it's a really common error for new writers, you know, to tell you too much up front, and don't, you need to tantalize and tease, I think, so that people are driven to read on and say, okay, who's Ben, or who's this, or where's Smithson, and all those things.
I think so, and I think writing in first person is both lazy and also really hard. And what I mean by that is that I find it easier, so you know it makes it sort of easier for me to write in that way. But it is then difficult to do what you said and to work out how much to give away, because if you're in someone's head, technically they can tell you everything because they kind of know everything that they know about something, but that's boring to read. So you sort of have to manage what's what they would assume the reader kind of already knows without over-explaining everything. But yeah, I'm really proud of the prologue, only because I wrote it right at the start. That was the first thing I wrote, and barely changed the whole time.
Really?
Yeah, it's just one of those things that was the first thing I wrote, and I think once I'd written that was why I kept being like, I've got to finish this book now, because it's sort of sitting there and I can't just keep putting it aside. Like it was quite motivating to then want to like continue on. So yeah, I'm really glad that kind of survived almost intact from the first draft.
You had to follow your own breadcrumbs.
Yeah, pretty much. I think I was like, I want to know what happens. So yeah, it's nice that it kind of made it all the way into the book. Yeah.
Did you know, in fact, when you wrote the prologue, how it was going to work out?
No, not when I wrote the prologue. I sort of wrote that and just sort of thought, oh, that's everything in my head out that I have thought about so far. Had the first few chapters kind of planned out, but it wasn't until a few months later that I sort of, it all clicked into place, and I sort of went, oh, that's how it's all going to work. Yeah, strange.
Well, no, I asked you that because you said you didn't start out to write crime, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily have thought out a plot.
That's right.
You know, if you weren't thinking about writing a mystery, you wouldn't necessarily go that direction.
That's completely right, and especially the book's timestamp, so it's got like that real police procedural sort of structure to it, which, you know, I never ever would have thought I would have written a book that had that sort of strict police procedural structure to it. So yeah, strange how things turn out sometimes.
Well, one advantage to a small town police force is that you can be pretty loose with police procedure. You know, it's not as formal as, let's say, the LAPD. So
yes,
there's room for you to make stuff up. In point of fact, if you want to.
Yeah, I've had a few arguments with a few professionals, where they've sort of been like, yeah.
Wouldn't really do it that way. But you know, the truth is, in a small force like that, you can do it any way you want to. Right?
And apparently that is true. So when I say that, people are like, that is true. That we did used to do that back when I was in this, you know, this sort of district, and I'm like, good, there you go. So it does help a little bit, yeah.
So I was talking to Sarah in the back. Melbourne is my favorite Australian city so far, of the ones I visited, and you were mentioning that Gemma will be in Melbourne at least some of the next book, right?
Yes, she's definitely in Melbourne for most of the next book, so yes, I've had to be a little bit less loose with the structure of it. But yeah, it's a completely different scenario, and it's a different case, different crime, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's been really fun.
Melbourne's a lovely city. It's a Victorian, or was built anyway, as a Victorian city. So it has it's completely different than Sydney. If any of you've seen pictures, you know, Sydney with all its high rises, looks like Shanghai or New York or something. Very much a water city, you know, beaches and of course the Opera House and the bridge and all that other stuff. But Melbourne is more like Chicago. It's actually like Evanston, which is right next to where I grew up, you know. Has a magnificent library, does have a harbor, not terribly far from a koala reserve and burrowing penguins and all kinds of things. So there's not a huge exurbia around Melbourne. You know, you can leave it and get out into the landscape and all, but it's a really gorgeous city. And trying to think what, in terms of climate, because we're obviously down under, but what would Melbourne be like? It doesn't really have winter like Chicago.
Well,
or maybe it does.
We think it does, but I think it's on a scale of not being as cold as you guys probably think cold is. But it's definitely got 4 distinct seasons.
Does it?
But I think our winter, you know, you might get as low as sort of, I'm going to say 5 degrees. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit.
It's not freezing.
Yeah, it's not freezing. So it's
it actually
it's
can
cold.
get that cold here at night. It's
cold.
40 something.
Yeah. It doesn't really ever snow in Melbourne.
Right.
But then in summer it can be really quite hot. So
right.
Yeah, it's a pretty it's quite a lot of rain in spring. It's, you know, in Sydney they always compare Melbourne's always raining and it's freezing. It's not quite true, but it's definitely not as warm as Sydney.
Well, it's a lovely place.
It's very pretty.
Lots of Australian. Well, there are series set in Sydney. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy who's written like 4,000 books set in Sydney. He has a Harry Devilish or Devlin, is, you know what I mean?
I do.
Right. And there's other books because that's where the money is and the action is, you know, so you can read about that. But people like Gary Disher write about more rural Australia, and say Michael Robotham has moved to Australia, and even though he was writing British, he's now writing Australian books. He's was published by Little Brown, but I'm not sure.
Yes, I think still
may have. I'm not sure. Adrian McKinty's moved to Australia, but he writes about Ireland. Carrie Greenwood, as you know, writes about Melbourne, but it's 1928 and 29 Melbourne. And then Sulari Gentle is also my author. She's over more towards the Blue Mountains, if I remember right. But she's also in 1932 Australia. A Few Righteous Men, and it goes on from there. And I really love her books. And through those, I have learned a lot about Australia. You know, we know a lot about Europe in the 1930s and, you know, the whole sort of run-up to World War II. But it's only by editing Sulari that I have learned that Australia was absolutely riven by fascists and communists and, you know, it's a lot like many of the debates in her books are very much like the immigration debates and things that we are experiencing here at the moment. And so I found them a real education, you know.
Yeah,
no, it's been fascinating and not in sync with England, you know, necessarily.
No, it's a real breakaway. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can recommend that you read them if you're interested in, you know, 20th century history. Both of them have fascinating stuff. Did you get to see the costume, we call it costume porn, the Miss Fisher Mysteries, if you have watched them, have the most fabulous clothes.
Yeah.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yep, and they did an exhibit, I think it was in Melbourne at the museum.
I did go.
Did you see it?
Yeah,
S.T. Davis was stand-in?
Yeah, she was amazing, yeah. With a great museum in Melbourne that does a lot of amazing exhibitions and things like that, and that was, I think, last
It
year,
was, I think it was
Yeah.
last year. Well, my husband, her publisher, refers
Yeah.
to it as costume porn.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, there's been money raised through crowdfunding to make
Yeah,
a
to
Miss
make
Fisher
film.
movie
Yeah.
because Essie Davis went back to London and didn't want to be staying in Australia to do more, although she might eventually, depending.
Yeah.
But I think it's really fascinating how much money they have raised through crowdfunding.
I think it
And
was
now the
a
Chinese
week,
have,
yeah.
yeah, now the Chinese have stepped in. They're going to be, so, you know, book art and the original covers that Allen and Unwin did for the Miss Fishers were all these beautiful Art Deco clothes. And it's amazing how
It's
just
really
jacket
good.
art can inspire,
Yeah.
you know,
It's very
stuff to go
popular.
on.
Yeah, and there was a huge sort of PR campaign around the same time as that
Yep.
crowdfunding exercise went out, and there was an awful lot of support for that to be made into a film.
And I want to give a shout out to Australian television because over Acorn, I think it is primarily in this country, one of the best things that Rob and I have watched in the last year is a thing called The Heart Guy. Did you see The Heart Guy? Oh my God. It's R-rated, and it takes place the Sydney cardiologist is caught one too many times with cocaine and stuff and sent back to his on a probationary period to his own hometown.
Doctor.
No, well, it's called The Hurt Guy over here, but maybe
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
it
it's really
too went through a whole crowdfunding thing to get a second season. But if you want to read about rural Australia,
Yeah.
like Smithson, for example, you cannot do better than to watch The Heart Guy on Acorn. And then there's a couple more. I mean, it's interesting that there's a whole thing in Australian television going on,
Yeah.
storytelling in a visual platform originating in Australia, as well as books now originating in Australia.
Yeah, I think there's been just a general resurgence or kickstart investment, whatever you want to call it, in just storytelling in general in Australia. So it's kind of everywhere. We've got really healthy playwright scene, theatre, exhibitions.
Well, you've had the Opera House forever.
Yeah, but I think it's the screen piece is really coming together over the last couple of years. So the TV series particularly, it's been amazing stuff coming out.
There
Really
have been.
incredible content. Yeah.
I'll have to look up. There's 2 or 3 more, but
The
if you
doctor one, I can't remember. The
What
one on
is
PBS?
what is that one? On PBS, yes.
Yeah, there's one on PBS.
this
now.
is different. Oh, you're talking about the guy in Cornwall, Doc Martin.
No, the Australian. He's an Australian doctor. It's
Oh.
after, in the 50s, after World War II.
Oh, that one I don't know. The Heart Guy is
No,
contemporary.
this is on PBS.
No, I got it, but I don't
But
know
it is
that
Acorn
one.
Media, I think.
Is it Acorn?
Yeah.
Well, I can understand. You know, one of the challenges that we all face in publishing and bookselling is that the sale of hardcover books is kind of flattened out, and you know how to get people more interested. And part of the problem is that there's so much great storytelling going on the visual platform that it's distracting. And I find if I'm not here with you, which I am almost every night, but on those rare nights when I am not here, Rob and I will sit down and watch, you know, one of these things. We're right now watching The Durrells in Corfu, which is beyond amazing. And I remember reading the Alexandria Quartet when I was an undergraduate at Stanford and being absolutely blown away. And then it was about when it was written, proving that I have read people like Robert
amazing.
Parker in real time over the years. Didn't quite make it with Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers, but it's I think the watching a story, visually presenting a story is different than reading a story, and in fact it's easier for a lot of people.
It is.
So Marshall McLuhan, when he talked about the medium, it's the message, wasn't kidding. And reading is a solo experience, and you have to interact with the book. But watching it can be a group experience, and it's passive as opposed to interactive. And so, if you're tired, or if you're sick, or you know, or you're just
You don't have to engage quite as
Exactly,
actively.
yeah.
For sure.
But the good news is that a lot of it is fueled by books, you know, original storytelling that then
Definitely.
becomes translated to the screen. So there's a lot of synergy going on.
And I think too, I mean, I'm completely the same as you. If I'm writing, I'm trying to ban myself from watching TV for a few weeks or whatever because I can't get it done. So I think everyone's, you know,
Right.
competing with this new content. But I just think it means that people that are writing books need to be extra compelling, because you're competing with this incredible medium and this endless, almost infinite hub of content. So you've got to be writing good books, otherwise people will do that instead.
Well,
but I think they can coexist. You know, I do think they feed off each other quite a lot, and I think there's some series over the last few years that I've just absolutely loved, and I'm sure that they influenced the kind of characters that I wanted to create when I was setting out to write this book, because, you know, they're so compelling, and you just sort of want people talking about them the way that they do when they finish watching a TV series, and they just want to share it and talk about it. It's very
if you
communal.
listen to dialogue too, I think it can be helpful in writing your own dialogue, you know, because storytelling, visual storytelling depends so much on dialogue.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a different...
Some of those writers for the shows they're amazing. You know, just I think the way they construct an hour of TV or whatever is so skillful. So yeah, it's very inspiring.
It is, and the good news is it's all storytelling.
Yeah,
so it's bringing
definitely.
us back to, you know, I go back and think, you know, what was it like in Homer's day when, you know, everybody had to memorize.
That's right.
It was all mnemonics and oral storytelling.
Yeah.
So,
It's
you
all
know,
important. Yeah.
Yep.
Definitely.
anybody have a question additionally? Virginia?
I'm just going to say, I don't watch much TV, because if I'm reading a book, if I miss a part or my mind wanders, I can go back and read it again. But if my mind wanders when I'm watching TV, I'm like, what were they doing? What happened?
You're
Yeah.
clearly not recording it. Which is how come I was watching 10th inning this afternoon at the Astros, thinking, I'm really glad I knew how the game came out before Rob queued it up. I would have had a heart attack otherwise. So.
Well, since LA beat Chicago, that means you're an Astro fan for this?
I'm not for the Dodgers, let me put it that way.
Okay.
I'm not an Astro fan. Actually, I could count on probably one hand the number of times I rooted for the American League in the course of my long life. He's a Cubs fan like me, so yes. But after all, they beat the Cubs, so why would I want anything good to happen to them? The Dodgers, I mean.
Oh, you were mentioning that, you know, your lead character goes to Melbourne. I'm about 250 pages through, and what I really like is your strong secondary characters.
Mm-hmm.
And is Anne going to come with us to Melbourne? Because she's the character that I really like in this book, is the secondary character.
I can't tell you that.
Oh, okay.
Only because it's not 100% finished, so I don't know. There's
Wow, that's really scary if she doesn't know either.
things can change a little bit. Some of the characters are still in the second book, but there is a whole lot of new ones as well. So,
Well, it just seems like in American crime fiction that we have a detective, and we usually have the medical examiner as a tag along, and I
Yeah.
was just hoping that that would be the case in your novel.
well, you just have to find out.
You made a really excellent point. The secondary characters really are fascinating. And also, you know, a challenge with writing in the first person novels, how do you make the secondary characters come alive if they're having to be filtered through Gemma's narrative? You know, what about Finn and his side of their relationship, or, you know, the partner, or, you know, the teachers at the school and all?
Well, also I think the high school boyfriend and then seeing his brother now at that same age was a really fascinating
Yeah.
look, you know.
Right,
Yeah.
but that's, I mean, it's easier to do that if you're writing in third person and you can, you know, be a little more omniscient as an author. So there were some real challenges to the way she presented it. And it's a tribute to you that the secondary characters are so alive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is. Like I said, I love writing in first person, and I think it's really, it can be really compelling, and it can be really intoxicating when you're reading, but it does present the challenge of being stuck in the one person's point of view. And if that person is, you know, like Gemma, she's a bit difficult sometimes. You know, I can imagine people might want to break from her as a reader. But yeah, then I think you have to work really hard at making the dialogue work.
Yeah.
So that you get those other people naturally coming into scenes without it sort of always just being through her telling you what they're like. Yeah.
No, I think that's definitely
Yeah.
true. Right. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
what motivated you to start writing, like in general, and if you have an advice, like for new writers?
I've always liked writing, always. I, remember being really young and like copying books out, like from other books, and just copying them for no reason particularly, but just making my own versions of them and things like that, and sort of taking a book and then writing what might happen next, like writing sequels to books that existed. So it's always been something I've really enjoyed. And then I sort of finished university and then fell into a career in advertising in a business kind of place, and I absolutely love that as well. So it sort of just got stuck on the back burner because I was busy. And then just a couple of years ago, I think I kept sort of working on these little pet projects in my spare time, and obviously because I really wanted to and really enjoyed it, and I just sort of thought I've really got to do this properly. If I'm going to finish something, I think finishing is really hard. So I actually set about writing some short stories, just because I thought it would be good to set myself a goal that I think is realistic. You know, writing a book right now when I'm working and I've got little kids, it's probably not that realistic. But maybe if I sort of try to write 5 short stories and really craft them and have them be perfect, that would be a good goal. So I did that, and I actually ended up writing 14, and I got them properly edited and proofed and everything, and sort of had a few people read them and then turn them into a little book so that they were actually done. And then for me, I mean, it wasn't profitable at all, but for me it was just a finishing thing. I wanted to sort of, I think, prove that I could finish something. And then once I did that, I felt much more confident to be able to sort of break a book into chunks and set about doing that. But, you know, I didn't finish the other book I started, so it doesn't always work. But I think you just have to really want it, and then you just have to find the time. You have to write it. That's the only way a book's going to get written.
But you make an important point. Small steps are often the way to go. If you just try to leap into a grand design, it can overwhelm you. But in fact, writing a book and publishing a book is the whole series of small steps. You know, the bookstore started out, you know, it was a little tiny thing over there on Main Street across from Molly's with just me. And, you know, it's been a whole series of steps along the way. Young Patrick, who was working up there, has worked for me since he was 18. The other Patrick in the back, it's the only job he's had is working for me, you know. But that was 20 some years ago, because the bookstore is 28 now. So, you know, who knew? I certainly didn't know when I started out it was going to turn out this way.
Yes,
So it's a whole
steps.
Series of steps,
Yeah, small
right?
steps is even now. I mean, I get feedback back from, you know, the editors and stuff, and they're like, oh, it is overwhelming, and then it's just, all right, well, I'll just do that page, and then I'll do that page, and then I'll tackle that. It's only ever little small steps that ladder into the big thing. So yeah, try and find some time. You've got to try and find some set time to do it.
Yeah, but if you can break it down into small steps with realizable ends, then it's not nearly so frightening, you know, because you can go a little distance and then another little distance and then another. Robert Parker used to say, you know, if he could write a page a day, that was a good goal, and then it got to be a little bit more, you know. I think you can defeat yourself by being too ambitious to do a lot. And also things change, and if you do it in small steps, it's a lot simpler to revise and, you know, go in a different direction or something. You don't have to. I try to make my authors send me 100 pages because it's not nearly as hard for them if I stop at 100 pages, if I say to them it's not on track or this or that may happen or something, than if they finished a whole book. To actually go back and give up a whole book or have to rewrite a whole book is daunting. But if you've only done 100 pages and your editor starts talking to you, you have a way better chance to, you know.
That's good advice.
Yeah. So many of them are bad authors and don't follow it, but the ones that do generally save themselves a certain amount of grief. Right. So Andy, actually, I held you up as somebody people could ask questions of tonight if they had any interest in talking to a professional publicist. So do any of you have questions that you might like to ask Andy about how you would take a book and steer it to into publication and then onward.
Give it to Barbara to read.
That's the lazy way. No, seriously, is there something that you're an aspiring writer, I'm guessing, so is there something you might like to ask about how it works or what you should do?
Like when is like the proper time like to approach or like to start looking, for a publisher? Like once you have like the whole book done, or like when?
I think it depends. Usually with fiction, I think if you're a debut author, I think it's probably good to have the majority of the novel written. And honestly, you'll hear this from a lot of people, but finding the right literary agent is the best thing that you can do for yourself, because they're the ones who are going to help you sell the book, and they'll know exactly who to go to, which editors. So it's not just like finding the right publisher, it's finding the right editor at the right publishing house who will understand what you're trying to do and how to make it work. And so what I always tell people who are aspiring is to look at some of your favorite current contemporary authors and look at the acknowledgments and look at the agent that they thank and send your query letter to those agents, and that'll be your way to go. Some of the best authors that I know, though, were turned down from their agents and their publishers time and time again at the beginning, and now they're big bestsellers. So don't be discouraged either.
You have to persevere, because the truth is nobody knows what the next big thing will be until suddenly there it is.
Yeah.
I'm asked that question all the time. I've discovered, for example, that bloggers would like me to do much of their work for them. So only today I had to answer like 3 different, and one of them wanted to know, what were the books I was most anticipating publishing next year, and I said, I can't even read November. There's 0 chance that I can tell you right now what it is I'm really excited about next year. But what I can do is show you our January calendar, and all of those authors, it's pretty much full. All of the authors coming here are books that I anticipate reading, and that I expect to like. It would certainly be rude of me to have them here and trash their books. So there's a certain compulsion, to liking it, and it's. I don't remember where I was going with that. What were we talking about? I've lost my train of thought there while I was. It was the next big thing, right? So it's the way publishing works at the moment. I have been asked to request authors to come here through next August. Well, I'm here to tell you that I have absolutely no idea, looking at the summer publishing schedule, which of those authors, aside from a few authors with whom I am familiar, I'm going to be interested in hosting here, and I can't possibly read books coming out next July. And even if I could, would I recognize the next big thing? When we debuted The Nightingale, do you think I thought when Kristen sat down with me to talk about The Nightingale a year ago that it was going to be a nightingale? Sometimes it takes a while, for books to develop those kinds of. And then everybody wants to follow it. If you notice, since how many World War II stories we've had, we have, what's his name, Mark Sullivan and the young Italian boy who led Jews over the Dolomites. Kristen's book is about leading. It's a wonderful book. I made you come and hear it, right? Because I knew you'd like it. And there's a whole series now of books about the roles that people played in different countries, helping people move into James R. Ben, it was Switzerland, different things. So books that are successful spawn other books of a similar nature, because people think, all right, if people really love The Nightingale, then, and it was a very good book, we'll want to read this. It's like the Da Vinci Code, and then we got Da Vinci clones for like 4 years at least, wasn't it? Almost every book involved a religious artifact, a lost religious artifact, and an evil conspiracy somewhere or other. The Silence of the Lambs, we had an absolute deluge of serial killer books, and then Twilight published was all vampires. And, then we got The Girl on the Train and Gone Girl, and it's domestic suspense and Trust No One, which is a little bit of your book. And so now, I think we're actually on the brink of the next big thing, but I'm not completely sure that I see it at this point. Do you?
No. And that's why, if we thought we saw it, it wouldn't be the thing.
That's true. That's true. And you know, books take so long to come into print. They're target things that authors can write for. For example, this is the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So unsurprisingly, there are 2 or 3 books out about, you know, historical events you can time for various anniversaries and things like that. But otherwise, you know, it's a moving target out there. And sometimes, coincidentally, 2 or 3 books will come out that are almost mirror images of each other, and people think, oh, well, you know, whichever one came out first inspired the rest, but that's not true, because it took them all a long time to come. So there's a weird, like, zeitgeist or coincidence thing that goes on sometimes, and I often wonder, you know, there was something floating out there, you know?
I so agree with that.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because when I was finishing this book and I'd actually handed it in, and then I read 2 books back in Australia that just were not the same but similar. And I mean,
Really?
I
How
you know, I
unnerving.
handed the book in. It wasn't anything,
Right.
you know, that was sort of influenced me, but really interesting that I think it's like baby names or something. They always say
Yeah.
that people just somehow sort of
It's all
through
Sean,
osmosis
and then
or
it's all
something, that
right.
suddenly people are sort of using this name, and it's almost not that they've heard it from someone else. They just like it. It's something about what's popular at that point in time. So, yeah, I think that just does. There is a zeitgeisty thing that happens.
I do too.
It's weird,
Yeah. Mike, the point is that you should write whatever moves you, because you actually can't write for the next big thing, because no one knows what it is. And so the best advice I always have for new writers is write the thing that you're passionate about, you know, because otherwise it's just
it's too hard otherwise.
right. And that's what you did, right? When you
Yeah.
wrote this book, you didn't
Well,
plan
I was
it.
even trying to finish the other one, and I was like, oh. And
You
even
know
though it was
what,
my
you're
idea,
gonna-
I was like, nah.
You're going to have to do something with the remnants of the other one.
I
You're
am,
going to go
yeah.
on suffering
I am.
over it forever.
I have since shown somebody, and they were quite positive about it. But see, it's tricky now because it's really different from this. So it's, you know, and you sort of obviously end up having a bit of a brand and expectation around what kind of thing you write. So I'll probably have to have a tricky conversation with someone like Andy at some point.
Sometimes, though, it's really good to break the mold. Michael Conley is going to be
Yeah,
with
that's
us
true.
Thursday night. Broke the mold when he wrote The Poet after he'd written 4 Harry Bosch books. And, you know, that was like a whole jump sideways. And he never wrote, well, there was one other book where the guy and the poet figured into it, but basically The Poet was just like a one-off, a story he really wanted to write. But it changed everything, you know,
Yeah.
so you can, you
Not
know,
quite
it's never a bad
common,
idea to do
but-
that at some point.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
So I have one final question for you.
Sure.
I'm a huge fan of Kate Morton, a fellow Australian. Do you have
Yes.
any idea why we haven't got a new Kate Morton book? I'm very impatient.
I don't. I don't know. I think she's probably just researching diligently, or I don't know. I don't know why.
I love her books. She's like an Australian, sort of like
She's a
Mary
beautiful
Stewart
writer.
or whatever. I mean, she just writes these big, wonderful, lush historicals, and some of them are set in England, and some of them are set in Australia, and they are just
Yeah,
fabulous.
she's very she's very revered in Australia. But I assume her process must just be really quite long. So maybe she's doing something. Maybe she's researching something really intricate. But I haven't heard of anything that's pending though.
Okay, I thought there might be gossip flying about in Australia.
Not that I've
but
heard, no.
oh well.
Sorry,
Rats.
I'll report back. If I
Okay, that'll be wonderful. Well, I certainly thank you for coming to see us. Let's give her a round of applause for a wonderful evening. And I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, because as I often say to you, if you aren't there at the beginning, you'll never be able to say you were there at the beginning. So thank you. It means a lot
So
to
much.
new authors to have you come. We've actually